Welcome back to the Rad Lab podcast. Today we have a special guest. Just to get into her background a little bit, she did her undergrad at the University of North Dakota. She went to grad school at Cornell. She was a NIH postdoctoral fellow at MIT. She is now an assistant professor at University of Minnesota. She is a senior investigator at the NSF Center for Sustainable Polymers. She won the 3M Non-Tenured Faculty Award. She also won an ACS Leadership Development Award. She's a seed investigator in the Materials Research Science and Engineering Center. And please welcome Dr. Jessica Lamb. Thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you because, your research combines two really cool things, polymers and organic chemistry, and you run at that interface, right? But before we get into your research, I would like to know a little bit about where you come from, and we'll work from there.
Sure. Absolutely. So I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, and I come from a very medical family. So, my grandpa, my dad, my brother, they're all doctors and nurses. Everyone's doctors and nurses. And I knew very early that I did not want to be a doctor or a nurse. But I was really good at math and science. So I'm like, what else can you do with that? And my neighbor across the street that I used to nanny for was a chemistry professor. And I think I just sort of imprinted on her as like, this is another path that you can do if you are interested in science and math. And so I had quote unquote decided to become a chemistry professor before I knew what that meant. And then it ended up working out very well for me because as I kept taking chemistry classes, I liked it and it worked, it really made sense in my brain. And then when I took organic chemistry in undergrad at the University of North Dakota, I was like, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. I really enjoy sort of the logic behind organic chemistry and the puzzle, problem solving element of it. So that was really fun. And then my undergraduate research experiences were sort of between organometallics and coatings and polymers. And so those were kind of where my interests lie. And so that led me to Jeff Coates at Cornell for my PhD. He works on polymer catalysis. And so I was like, great, this combines my two interests. And then I joined the group and then I didn't do polymers at all because that's how that goes sometimes. So I was doing small molecule organic chemistry, developing new reactions, understanding mechanisms, stuff like that. But I was doing that within a polymer group. And so I was still surrounded by people doing polymers. So I was still thinking about polymers even though I wasn't doing it myself. But I really enjoyed that. I really like understanding how and why things work. I really like synthesizing molecules that no one's ever made before. Those are the types of things that really motivated me in graduate school. But I was still really interested in polymers. And so when I wanted to kind of switch for my postdoc, right, I wanted to get an adjacent skill set. And so then I ended up going to MIT with Jeremiah Johnson, and I actually did work on polymers there. So got my own skill set in polymers. Because I knew that in my independent career, I kind of wanted to do these two things. And it made sense as I was kind of going along the path of no, it actually does make sense for me to become a chemistry professor, even though I had decided way too early to do that. But I learned that I really like research because I like to continually learn new things. And I really like mentoring specifically graduate students. I love that transition between undergrad and grad school and sort of the mental switch of oh, you need to filter everything through your own brain now, right? I really, really like that switch. And so that's really how I think about the job and why I do the job. And so I was really fortunate to get at the University of Minnesota, so it's very close to home, but it's also a great polymer department. It's a really great department in terms of we care about diversity and mental health and safety and all of these things. So I think the department really shares my values in that way. And so I was very fortunate to end up in that department, who were very supportive. And yeah, I have a really great group of students.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Sounds like you have a great home at University of Minnesota, especially if they check all your boxes. That can be very hard to find sometimes. But I think it's great how you when you went to your postdoc, you decided to do something adjacent and kind of not necessarily learn something new, but do something a little different. And I think a lot of people move away from that when they go on to their postdoc. I'm a firm believer, if you're going to do a postdoc, do something a little different. Expand your mind a little bit, because that's going to get you more out of it. You're going to get more out of it.
Exactly. I think don't just do things to do things, right? Yeah. You should be gaining new skills such that you can then kind of articulate why your skill set is unique. And I think especially if you're interested in going to academia, that's really, really important, right? It's like, why you, right? It's like, well, I have this specific skill set because I have these different experiences that allow me to do something that other people can't do.
Exactly. Make yourself marketable.
Exactly.
Like, wear different hats. It's always awesome. So you said you figured out you wanted to be a professor very early on. Was there a specific moment that kind of like drew you to chemistry that you can think of?
So, kind of. So when I was like classic overachiever in high school. And so I was taking all of the AP classes I could possibly take, right? So I didn't have time in my schedule to take regular chemistry. And so my best friend and I tested out of chemistry together. So she's a lawyer now. She's very smart, but very English brain, right? and so we studied together. We just like read the book, took the test, whatever, tested out. But I wasn't planning on taking AP chemistry until my senior year, and she enrolled in AP chemistry in our junior year. And she was like, "You're not taking chemistry with me? What do you mean? Like, I need your help with this," because she's like an English person. So I was helping her with her AP chemistry homework, and I had never taken a chemistry class before. Because at that level, it's like, it's mostly math. So I'm like, I can figure this out by reading the book. But it just made sense in my brain. Like, I could just read the book, and I'm like, yep, that seems logical to me. And then I could explain it to other people. And so it was always something that made sense and was just very intuitive to me. But then it really was like organic chemistry that I was like, oh, this I actually enjoy doing also. But it was not just one moment. It was multiple moments as I would like reflect as I learned more, right? Like I learned what graduate school was like, and then figuring out that I liked research and mentoring. And then I learned what do chemistry professors actually do, right? Because it's not actually like in the lab very much. And so yeah, there were a lot of checkpoints along the way where I sort of kept reaffirming, oh, no, I do actually want to do this, and this is why, and like this is where my skill set is, and I think that I can make a difference in this way and stuff like that.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, no, I think some people have that aha moment, and others, it's a learned process through, and I think for sure. For me, it was definitely not a singular moment. It was just like as time went on, I'm like, I think I'm good at this. I think I can do it, even though I don't think I ever got an A in a chemistry course on any level. But somehow I'm here, So but I think it's just something you learn to love over time, and you just kind of get sucked into it. Like you mentioned before with organic molecules, making something no one's ever made before, right? That's really attractive to do, like doing something different,
Yep.
For me, it was, getting to handle isotopes that people rarely get to use on a day-to-day basis, and like make a crystal structure that no one's ever seen before. And so I think a lot of it is that in the creativity that goes into that as well.
Right.
So I think that's awesome. So you were at Cornell for grad school. I know grad school can be very tough, right? So what got you through grad school?
Yeah, people, friends, cohort, all of that is really important. I tell my students this all the time, right? Like make friends with your cohort, with people in other labs, people within your own lab. Like those connections are what get you through. Because there's always going to be hard times, but everybody sort of has hard times at different times, and so you can lean on each other at like in different ways. But also like for me, the hardest part is if you feel stuck. Right? And so being able to talk to people and just get new ideas of what are possible paths forward will allow you to feel less stuck. So even if it's not working, if you're learning new things and there's a path forward, it makes it a lot easier. The other thing is like connecting what you're doing in grad school to where you want to go, right? Having a goal, knowing why you're doing it, such that it's not just like, why am I putting myself through this? But it's like, no, I know why, because I want to get to this end goal. That's really important. But also having something outside. So I was a competitive ballroom dancer in grad school. And so I, especially early on, was dancing probably 5 times a week, which was a lot. But then on the weekends, sometimes we'd drive down to competitions and things like that. And I sort of got out of competing pretty quickly because I've been a dancer my whole life. So I like dancing just for the sake of dancing. But it was really mentally stimulating of like understanding the dance and like the social aspect of having sort of like the dance team, and then like the physical activity also. So it's like all of those things kind of in one. So I think it's really important to have something outside of grad school such that you can actually like be a full human being.
Yeah, balance is definitely a big thing. Like you can't just, chemistry can't be your whole life, even though some people say it can be or should be. There's always those old, professors, old guard that say that, should be your life, but no, it's that balance is what carries you through, and what it ultimately will sustain you through life, not just through chemistry. But that's great that you had ballroom dancing. I think I had swimming. I was a competitive swimmer all through college and things like that. So that's what I leaned on as my, but being friends with your people in your lab and outside, that definitely makes it a lot easier. And some of the people that I've met in grad school, like, I was groomsmen in their wedding. They were groomsmen in my wedding, so you make lifelong friendships because you're kind of going through this struggle. It's like, I don't know, like, what do they call it? Trauma bonding. Yeah. They call it trauma bonding. Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of a little bit of that, but and I think grad school can be a very, very good thing, but there is a lot of ups and downs, like you said, because projects work and then they don't work.
Yep.
And so getting through that is a big part of being resilient, is a big part of getting through grad school. So with grad school in mind, if you had to do grad school all over again, right, and you could only take one skill back with you, what would be that one skill you would take?
Probably time management. I am so much better at time management now than I was as a graduate student, because you have to be, right? As a faculty member, you wear so many different hats, just so many hats all the time, and you have to be able to switch between things much faster. So as a graduate student, I was very bad at writing in small chunks. I always felt like I needed big swaths of time to like get progress on anything writing wise. That is not a reality anymore because I don't have those like big chunks of time. And so I'm much better at like being productive in smaller chunks of time, which I think would have been very useful at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you're not on RA, you're TAing, you got, group meetings to figure out, and all kinds of stuff. There's so many things that can fill up your time. And like when you're not setting up a reaction, you're trying to work things up. Like, and especially I think every grad student falls into the trap of like their last year trying to write everything, and how like if you just would have written a little bit here and there throughout your time as grad student, you would have saved yourself so much heartache and pain later
very
on.
Much so. I ended up writing my dissertation in 3 weeks. I do not recommend. I do not recommend. I basically became a robot for 3 weeks, and it was awful. And then I just like collapsed for a while afterwards.
3 weeks? Yeah. Wow. And
some of them were published, right? Like that's the only reason I could have done that is because a couple of my chapters were already published. So turning a published paper into a chapter is very fast.
Yes.
But I was still collecting data for one of my chapters. Wow. So it was not good. Do not recommend.
No, 3 weeks is a very tight period. I think I wrote mine over the course of like 2.5 months, but my schedule, I was a delinquent. I finished basically all my research kind of, so I was just only focused on writing. So I would come into lab around 10 a.m. and then I would like watch Netflix or YouTube for like an hour and then bug somebody to get lunch with me, get lunch, come back, take a nap, watch more YouTube and Netflix. Everyone would leave, and then by midnight, I'd be ready to write. And so my writing hours were between midnight and 4 a.m.
Fascinating.
So I would write from midnight to 4 a.m. And I bought a cot so I could like take a nap inside. Like, when everyone's gone, I could take a nap, like a 15-minute nap, like in between like that writing time. And so I write between midnight and 4 a.m. and then I go home and then come back at 10 a.m. and do it all over again. And that was my writing schedule. I I feel bad for the first years that were like sitting next to me because it was just, they were like, what are you doing? You don't do anything. But, I had the luxury of being able to do that because of all the hard work I did before.
Right.
But yeah, it was, I wouldn't recommend that either, but I think I needed no one to be there. I needed zero distractions. So by the time midnight rolled around, I've watched everything I could possibly watch that day. And so, all the people I was subscribed to already had their videos out. I've already watched them. And so I had no distractions. And like, I don't know I couldn't do that now,
Right.
and I'm a lot healthier, I think, in my
Yes.
writing. But back then, that's what I had to do in order to focus. So don't do that either. If you're listening, don't do that either.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not
Time
good.
management. Start early.
Yes, time management. I think
Accountability buddies. Very important.
I think everyone's bad at time management, so it's hard to have.
It's so hard. But if somebody's expecting you to send them a draft or like something, that triggers in your brain like, oh, I really need to get this done.
Yeah.
And so just having somebody enforcing some sort of deadline is very helpful.
Yeah, or just the social pressure. If you
Yes.
surround yourself with people who are on the ball
Yes.
and you're not, you'll be like, oh, I need to be on the ball.
Exactly.
So you got to know who to put around you to force you to do good things. And, I think universities kind of take that kind of, track with who they hire and stuff like that. And so great advice. Time management, perfect. So over the course of your career, you've published, countless publications, right? They're in a lot of ways, they're like children. It takes a lot of effort to get them out of there, a lot of time, to cultivate them into something that's, worth putting out there. So out of all your publications, which one is your favorite?
Okay, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to choose two. I'm going to choose one from when I was a grad student, and I'm going to choose one as a PI, because they're very, very different.
That's fair.
And it is hard to choose because every project is very unique, right? And each one has a story of how it kind of came to be. And a lot of my publications are like, that's not what I was trying to do. And then something crazy happened and I did that instead. But my favorite one from grad school actually didn't come out until maybe 2 years after I graduated. It had 3 co-first authors because this is one of those projects where it was like lore in the group. If you can get this to work, it would be great. And it was like a catalysis thing where we're trying to find a catalyst to do a carbonylation of isobutylene oxide. So it's an epoxide with 2 methyl groups on it. And you're trying to insert a CO molecule, so carbon monoxide, on the side of the 2 methyls. Right? That's very difficult because it's like sterically encumbered to make a molecule known as povalolactone. And povalolactone can be polymerized into polymers that are interesting, et cetera, et cetera. But we were focused on making the monomer from isobutylene oxide. And it's one of those things that was like, the best we'd ever been able to do is selectivity 3-to-1 in the wrong direction. And I was the first one to get it to go in the opposite direction. And that was like run down the hallway screaming kind of day because it was so exciting. People had been trying to do it in our group for 10 years. Yeah. And I was the first person to get a hit in the correct direction. There were all sorts of problems with that. The catalyst was insoluble, so then it was very inconsistent, yada, yada. So I passed the project off to somebody else, who then passed the project off to somebody else. But eventually, that was published in ACS Catalysis like 2 years after I graduated. But I was so proud of it because it was so difficult to do. And it took so many different people working from so many different angles to like solve this problem, and then solve this problem, and then solve this problem. And like eventually, it like was able to come out. And it was just like a story in resilience, a story in like, sometimes you just have to try things, right? If you know that this is a target, but you don't necessarily know how to do it, you just have to keep trying, like not as your main project, because that's going to be super frustrating, but just sort of in the background, right? And like trying cool things that may or may not work, and then that will sort of eventually bear fruit. I think, again, that's like a lot of my stories from grad school and postdoc was just like, I'm trying to do something and then something crazy happened. And so being able to like be curious and be like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. But actually, is that more interesting? Maybe. Let's go do that. So that is like really, really fulfilling to me, I think. But as a PI, so I'm pretty early. I just started my 5th year as an assistant professor. And so we have like 5 publications out right now. And my favorite is the one that we just published because it's the new one. But it's on combining different mechanisms of polymerization sequentially. So like doing a cationic polymerization and then an anionic polymerization without any steps in between. That was just published in Chemical Science a couple months ago. And like that has been an idea in my head since like 2019. And it was part of my original job proposals. I wanted to make it work. It's like, there's gotta be a way. Like we could actually put 3 mechanisms together with no like intermediate compatibilization steps. It's very, very challenging to do. I had 2 students working on it for like maybe a year and a half before we got even our first hit to make it work. And so it was just like, we were trying to do the hardest thing first, which is a rookie assistant professor mistake. But once I realized that, it's like, oh, let's not do the hardest thing first. Let's do the easier thing first. But it works. And it's like, we can actually make materials that nobody can make before. And that's super cool to me. And I'm a very mechanistically oriented chemist. And so being able to think about the mechanism and how that interfaces with how you would do this is very cool. And so I'm very proud of that, because it was just one of those things that was like, wouldn't it be cool if?
Yeah.
And I don't know how we're going to make it happen. And then we did. And so that was very fulfilling also.
Yeah, no, I think that, like, it's kind of like Inception, where you kind of have an idea and plant it in your mind and you can't shake it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, until it, like, you kind of like either flush it out and say, okay, it's not possible, or you actually make it work. It's like, you can finally breathe about it and things. But that's awesome that it was successful, and it sounds like an amazing thing. So if I'll try to get those titles from you, and I'll try to put them in the description. So if you're listening and you would like to look at those publications, they'll be in the description of these of this podcast. So going back to your, I guess, grad school paper, that story reminds me of kind of a lot of professors who just have this ongoing project, and it's kind of like you said, it's like a myth. It's like, if you can get this to work, and you're like, a lot of like other like upper like classmen or upper graduate students will warn you about this project. If he tries to give you this, try something else. Like, but it speaks to, you always need more than one project, especially in grad school. And, and just trying things is a great thing. Like, even if your PI says, I don't think that's going to work, try it anyway. Right. And, as long as it's safe, right? Within reason. Right. Like, you shouldn't be doing things that'll, or
ridiculously expensive.
Exactly, right? So if you're spending a lot of money, but if you could do it, within reason, they may not think it may work, but if you get it to work, it's even better.
I have another story about that. So my first JAX paper in grad school, I was like, we did like this big mechanistic study. That was another thing where it was like, people in our group work on epoxide carbonylation, and then I wasn't even doing that. I was kind of like off on my own little island doing stuff. But it was like, I was doing a lot of mechanistic stuff, right? And so I was thinking about like, okay, can I do a kinetic isotope effect to like see what the rate or like turnover limiting step of this reaction is? So I like designed the synthesis of like the deuterated substrate. I made it. I did the kinetic isotope effect. So, but I hadn't told my PI that I was doing this. And so at the next subgroup, I start like walking through it of like, here's my logic. And I was designing, the kinetic isotope effect. And he like looked at the substrate, and he's just like, I don't think that's going to work. And I'm like, next slide. It did already. He was like, never mind. So it's just like those types of moments, right? Where you're just like, your PI doesn't know everything. Yep. Like, sometimes you actually know better. And so some of the process of graduate school, especially I think the first couple of years of graduate school, is like becoming more confident in your own knowledge, knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, such that if you know it, right? And you can trust your instincts to be like, actually, this is the way that I want to test it, because it is what's going to tell me like what it is. And then it becomes your job to convince your PI and then convince the reviewers, right? But it's not your PI's job to do that. It's your job to do that. Yeah. And so that, I think, is like, that was like a very like proud moment for me. Yeah. Like, no, I know what I'm doing, and like it actually showed what I wanted it to show. That must
have been a confidence boost out the that would have been amazing. Because a lot of you can hear some horror stories from group meetings and things like that. But I think like graduate student, like going into grad school, you don't understand that the process of grad school is you're becoming a peer, right? And process of becoming a peer is being able to question other peers and to confirm and things. So that's all part of the process. So if you can start, doing that, obviously maybe not do that your first year, because you might be a little bad, but but if you, as you go through, you gain that confidence. You're in the lab more than they are. Right. They are writing other things. They aren't as in tune with the chemistry as you are, so you end up being the expert in the room.
Exactly.
So you have to be able to, like, as you move on, you have to be able to have those conversations of why you think something will work when someone doesn't think it'll work. And I think more grad students should realize that they're becoming a peer, not always just kind of this perpetual underling.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's a really important transition between like being a junior graduate student and being a senior graduate student, right? It's okay to be a junior graduate student when you first start. You're learning, you're figuring out like, what are the norms of the field? What are the expectations? Like, what is the context of your work? Like, all of these things that you need to sort of work through. And then you start to be like, oh, I'm not thinking so hard about those things anymore because they're now ingrained in me, and I'm sort of making that switch into being an expert and being the one who actually knows more about what's going on. I think that it's a joke that you're ready to graduate when you think that you know more than your PI, right? Which was so true for me. My 5th year of graduate school, I very much remember being like, what are you talking about? Like, I know so much more about what's going on than you do, all this stuff. And then now as a PI being like, well, of course that's true. Like, I was the one in the lab and he was not, but I didn't fully grasp sort of the different roles, right? Being a PI is very different than being a graduate student. Your role is different. And so as a graduate student, being able to be like, no, I know that I know more about my project than my PI, that is sort of like, yeah, you're definitely ready to graduate now. But now coming from the other side of it, I appreciate more what my PhD advisor was doing because I didn't understand all of the things at the time. But I do think that that's like a funny joke of like, you will feel like your PI is dumb by the time you're at the end because you understand the things that they don't know.
Yeah, no, and that's the progression, and I think that's definitely a point that I think most people get to. So you told me that you're really into Dungeons and Dragons.
I am. That's true.
How do you think Dungeons and Dragons has translated to you being a professor, a PI, a lecturer, or all the facets of your job now?
Yeah. So for me, the biggest, I guess, benefit that I have gotten from Dungeons and Dragons that I can use in my real job is emotional intelligence. I think one of the things, like I play D&D because I really enjoy the character development and the arc, and every time I make a new character I try to make them as different as possible from my previous character, and yet every character is a reflection of me in some ways, right? So it's kind of like exploring different sides of me, and I very much believe that I play every character for a reason. I have learned things about myself through playing that, but the ability to look at my different characters that I have made very different on purpose and be like, I can imagine if given a specific scenario, my different characters are going to respond to that in different ways because they are different people, makes it very easy for me to put myself in other people's shoes, right? And so as an advisor and as like a mentor and a leader, being able to give people the benefit of the doubt, because even if you don't know what they're thinking, you can imagine a scenario where they are being very reasonable, even if they disagree with me, right? And so that ability to be like, okay, you're making this assumption about what somebody else is feeling, but could we imagine that that's not true and that actually they just don't understand or they don't have as much information as you do or whatever it is? And that ability was something I didn't realize was something that I was getting good at until I was I was a postdoc, talking to another postdoc who was like having some interpersonal conflicts with somebody. And she was explaining to me the situation, and I was like, well, is it possible that this other person is thinking about it from this other perspective? And she was just like, oh, I never considered that before. And I was like, that seemed very obvious to me, And so I think that is like such an important thing. And like one of the reasons why like collaborative storytelling in general is very fulfilling. It's like super fun to be able to like put yourself in a different mindset and respond in a different way. Like I really like that like immersive element of it. But then also you don't get to decide what happens, right? Because you're playing off of everybody else. You're having to interpret the dice, like all of these things that I think, I don't know, is more interesting to me than regular media, I guess. Or like other board, like I'm a big board game person too, but it's like a very different space. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think our job as like faculty members is a lot of management and dealing with people, right? We're not the ones in the lab. We're like, we look at data and we like do writing and science. Yes, that is true. But really the core of the job, what we're doing every day is working with people. And so the better you are at interpersonal relationships, I think the more successful you're going to be. And so I think that I attribute a lot of like my emotional intelligence and empathy and things like that to how much I have played D&D.
Oh, that's awesome. I think that's great. I think you've got to be able to see both sides of the coin, mm-hmm. for sure. Like it's especially, because in groups, whenever you have groups of people together, there's always going to be conflict of some sort. Mm-hmm. And being able to, navigate that and be able to, talk some people off the ledge, let's say, it's think it's a great skill to have as a PI for sure, especially, as you have more and more graduate students, emotions can run high.
Yeah.
Everyone's kind of stressed out. Everyone can be failing at the same time at a project, at their respective projects, and it can get a little bit tense at times.
Right. But also like making sure it's clear that conflict is not a bad thing, right? Conflict can be very healthy, right? And we want to push each other to be better and to be thinking about the science in new ways, right? And not letting people just like think about it on the surface level. It's like, no, we got to push you to think a little bit deeper. And so, yeah, I think that all of those things are really important. And so I talk a lot to my students about like, it's okay to have conflict, but let's handle it in a respectful and responsible way. And let's talk about things before they blow up into a major deal, right? Yeah. So like, even if it's a small thing, it's okay. Bring up the small thing. And we'll say it's a small thing, but let's try to course correct before it becomes a big thing, right?
Yeah.
But that's really sort of core to my mentoring philosophy, which is Radical Candor. I don't know if you've heard of that book. So Radical Candor is a book written by Kim Scott. She was like an executive at some of like big tech companies. So not all of the book is related to academia because it is written for like tech companies, but I really, really like the framework, which is that you both care personally and also challenge directly. So you have to care personally first, right? People need to know that you are giving them feedback from a place of, I want you to be better. I want to help you grow into the best scientist or the best person that you can be. But the only way I can do that is by constantly telling you how you can improve. But also I want that feedback too. So like making sure that it's a two-way street and that everybody needs to buy into that system of like, we are all collectively trying to help each other be better. That's how we can be the best that we can be.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Yeah, I think I try to get, feedback from my students, as they leave and as they graduate or go into grad school. I always try to get some feedback from them and like, how could I have been better? I haven't done everything perfectly for sure, and there's things obviously I need to work on in certain aspects, but, that back and forth is always like, I think students feel like they don't have a voice. And I feel like that's crazy to me when like they have the most power on campus. They have the most power, they're the ones doing the chemistry. Like they control a lot of things, and without them, we wouldn't succeed. Right. And so they're a crucial part of the machine and have that responsibility. But, no one likes too much responsibility. That's me. Personally, I don't know.
But like that's actually what I talk to my students about, right? It's like, because it is a responsibility, right? And that's why you need to be bought into the system. You have to understand that it's not radical honesty, it's radical candor. So what's the difference? Honesty, you can be honest and not say anything.
Yeah.
Candor, you are obligated to say something, right? You have to be proactively thinking about like, what could be better about this? Or, oh, that's somebody else's problem. No, it's not. Make it your problem. Go fix the thing, right? Don't let things just like balloon out into like these massive problems if we could just fix it, right? And so like that personal responsibility part of it of like, no, I am part of this community. I need to be both soliciting and giving feedback in the same way that everybody else is in order to make the whole thing work. And so like that's why I think that philosophy is so core to how my group functions, because if people don't buy into it, it's going to fall apart because it relies on people talking about what's happening and actively thinking about what can be improved. Because I'm not in the lab all the time. I'm not around all the personal dynamics all the time. I'm not like, I don't know everything that's going on. And so if I don't know it's a problem, I cannot do anything to fix it. And so I have to trust my students to tell me when there's a problem, or even if it's not a problem, tell me when there's a barrier, right? So that I can try and address it. And so I select very hard for that during the recruitment process to be like, I need to find people who want to be in that environment, because it's not for everybody. And that's okay. Like part of advisor selection in graduate school is finding the group and the advisor that works well for you. And you have to realize that you know yourself better than anybody else. So nobody can tell you what is the right answer. You have to decide that for yourself. And so for students who want to join my group, I'm like, you have to want this. If you don't want this type of environment, because it can be intense. You're getting feedback a lot. And I don't let my students just coast, right? It's always, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? But like, I think that that's the way to grow the most. And graduate school ultimately is a time of rapid growth. And so that's why I'm like trying to do that. I don't think that that's necessarily sustainable for the rest of your life, but because graduate school is what it is, like that is the time to be pushing to get as many skills as you can and really like broaden your horizons as much as you can.
Yeah. Because from that point on, you kind of fall into a more specific niche as you go farther. Like you just get more and more specific on what you like to study, that you find this little niche and that's where you work. And so that's the great part of graduate school, is you can still explore so many different things. You can pivot so easily. And, and that's what kind of tenure is for. You're going up for tenure hopefully in the next year, right?
Probably 2.
Next 2 years because of COVID. We'll get to that. We'll get to talk about that. But, and like that's what tenure's for, right? So you can pivot and be able to explore. And I'm hoping when I get there, I still have the energy, but, because the tenure process can be super draining. But, I think students take that for granted, that, man, like this is like one of the last times you'll be able to explore this much and not have to worry about, funding and getting money, and you're just kind of in there just doing it. And oh man, sometimes I wish I could I don't know if I would want to go back all the time, but every once in a while, it would be a nice thing to do. But so since we mentioned COVID, so you started your group in the middle of COVID, like summer of 2020, right?
Correct, July 2020.
So how was that experience?
Not great. I mean, it was fine, right? So the reason that it ended up being fine is because my students are freaking amazing, right? And like, it takes a special student to be the first student in a group, right? It really does. And that's definitely true for me. And so I had 2 students start with me that summer, just setting up the lab, right? The only reason that they could come in is to set up the lab. We had to be social distanced and masked and all that stuff. And basically, they would set up the lab, find drawers to put things in, label the drawers, all the things, while I would be like ordering the next things so that by the time they were done with that, they would have more things to do. But everything was so difficult to do because we couldn't bring vendors in on campus, right? So like trying to ordering things and looking at requirements and stuff like that was very, very challenging. None of my colleagues were on campus. And so you couldn't just walk down the hall and ask a senior colleague what you could do, right? Or like, what should I do in this situation? Or who do I talk to for this? So there was one other assistant professor, Professor Courtney Roberts, who's 1 year before me. So she started in 2019. She just gave her tenure talk yesterday. And she's one of my best friends and definitely is the reason that I got through this process, because she was on campus, like, because she was in her 2nd year and I was in my 1st year. We were like the only 2 professors on campus for a while. And I would go to her for everything because she was there. And so she bailed me out of a couple of things that I didn't know that I needed to know, right? And then she helped me navigate that and we got through it. But everything was so slow. And so we didn't really even start doing experiments until like January, because it was like trying to set up the lab, and I didn't have an office on campus in the fall until like Thanksgiving, and then I got COVID, and then there was like the quarantining for holiday travel and all this stuff. So we didn't really start experiments until January, so I already felt really behind. My students were amazing, so like they did do a lot of work in that spring, but really it was that first summer where things really started to take off because the students were so zoomed out. All their classes were on Zoom, all their TAing was on Zoom, our group meetings were on Zoom, our one-on-one meetings were on Zoom, everything was on Zoom. Yeah. And so they were so like, I want to get in the lab and do actual experiments, right? So that first summer, they just hit it really hard, which was so like relieving for me as like an assistant professor. And so we got a bunch of data. We proved that a project wasn't going to work and we pivoted to something else, right? Like we did all these things and like sort of like really established the foundation sort of at the end of that first year. And one of my students, July Pham, who's graduating this year, which is really crazy. She got so much data that first summer that like we got an NSF grant on our first try the next year because we had so much preliminary data because of that. So like, yeah, it was just all of these things made that first year really, really hard, that I feel like I have blocked most of it out. Sometimes my students will tell me things that happened that year that I'm like, I don't remember that. I believe you, but I don't remember. But there were also some good things that came out of it. So for example, my students realized that the barriers to communication were very high. And so they were very intentional about what can we do to make these barriers lower. So they would ask me things to fix that problem structurally. So for example, they were like, we want to have conversations beyond just the science. We feel like when we have one-on-one meetings, we should be talking about the science because it's very important for us to get the science up and running, but we want to talk about other things too. Can we build it into group meeting to have a segment of group meeting where we talk about other things? So as a response to that, we now have AMAs, or Ask Me Anythings, at the end of every group meeting, and it rotates who gives the question, and it's whatever they want to talk about. And so sometimes it's science related. So sometimes it's like, okay, how do you lay out, like, how do you make a good figure? Or how do you write? Or what are tips in ChemDraw or Word or whatever? Or time management, or imposter syndrome, or how do you read patents, or whatever people want to talk about, ethical uses of ChatGPT, whatever. And I don't always know the answer, right? But I will spend just like 15 minutes putting my thoughts down and then start the discussion, and then other people can chime in. So we just talked about like internships. So like I never did an internship, but one of my students has done an internship. Others of my students have looked into internships. And so I said how I think about it, and then everybody else kind of chimed in. So it allows us to have these broader conversations, and different people have different perspectives. And so they will ask different questions that other people might not think to ask, but everybody benefits from the answers. And so I think the AMA thing that we do, which is in group meeting every week, but also is like a thing that I do with my first years, is sort of a special thing that I do with my group to really focus on skill building even outside the lab.
No, that's awesome. I might steal that. That's a
Do it.
great.
It's great.
That's a great. I need to write this down. I think. No, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. I wish I had a little bit of that.
But again, it wasn't my idea, right?
Yeah.
This was the students being like, "We need this," and I'm like, "Okay, let's make it happen." So we did, and now we still do it, and I think that it's a really good thing.
Oh, that's great. I think a lot of professors should take note of that for sure, and I think that just speaks to the communication you have with your students and their comfortability with bringing ideas to you, and I think that speaks volumes about who you are as a person and as a professor, as a PI. So I think that's amazing. So the chemistry you do, you said, is at the cross section of organic and polymers. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
Yeah. So we have some projects that are more organic. We have some projects that are more polymers. But I'm really a physical organic chemist, right? So what does that mean? We like to systematically change structure and then see how that affects reactivity or properties or whatever you want to study. And so by doing that, you can sort of learn something more fundamental about what's happening with the chemistry. So either how is the mechanism working, or how are these polymers coiling, or whatever, right? And so all of our projects sort of have that theme of this more systematic understanding of what's going on and using mechanism and sort of these underlying principles to better understand chemistry. But we do that in a lot of different contexts. So we have 3 major project areas, and they are all completely non-related, which is, I don't know, maybe I've spread myself too thin. It's a thing, but I don't know. I like them. They're interesting, and I think that it allows each of my students to build their own expertise. Right? It's not like we have 4 people who work on this one project area that all have the same skill set. That's super not true. Right? We have some people who are like, oh, this person's really good at high pressure reactions, and this person's really good at photochemistry, and this person's really good at electrochemistry, or whatever it is, and therefore all the students can kind of talk to each other and help each other out because not everybody has the same skill set. So it's very diverse, but we do everything from catalysis, like N-heterocyclic carbene organocatalysis, to making really crazy polymers, to like the more mechanistic polymerizations that I was describing earlier. So they all have these like themes of physical organic chemistry and mechanisms and a lot of synthesis. We make very esoteric looking molecules, and so you have to be very good at synthesis. So the first 6 months in my group probably looks like an organic chemistry lab because you have to learn how to make the things. But we don't just make things to make things, right? You make things to learn something else. And so whether that's the systematic variation, whether that's a new monomer that's going to teach us something new, and we are very open to like keeping an eye out for interesting mechanistic questions that we can then ask. Because I'm very, very fundamental, I don't work very close to the application, but if we can understand the fundamentals better, we should be able to design the next material, the next catalyst, whatever, in a more rational way.
Okay, so you have a lot of different projects.
Yes.
And this is me asking a question, I guess, for me.
Sure.
how do you manage all those ideas at once? Because for me, I think I have a similar issue. I have like 3 or 4 projects going. My brain kind of wants to snap in half when I have 3 students all in the lab together, all asking me different things about different projects. And I'm just, how do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I, again, am very fortunate to have very amazing students, and so I put a lot on them, right? So I kind of go in phases. If I'm writing a grant on that project, I'm going to be a lot more in it, right? Or we're trying to publish a paper in that project, I'm going to dig really deep. But I can't go super deep into all the projects all the time. And so instead, I rely a lot on my students, right, to help each other. So I would say my first 2 years, I was much more involved, right, because I had to be. They didn't have older students to ask questions to, but I also trained them to talk to other people in other groups, talk to other faculty, talk to people in chemical engineering. Like, I instilled in my students very early on that I did not have all the answers. And so they can find support in other ways. But I have my skill set and I can help with certain things, so I can help them when they have those problems. But a lot of it is the training of like, it's your job to figure this out. It's my job to help give ideas if you're stuck, right? I can't solve the problem for you. I can't do your job for you, but I have more experience. I have a bigger network. So if you don't know what to do, I can be like, oh, go talk to this specific person or this specific group. Or I know that this generally exists in the literature. Go look up that. Or, you know, I know that this technique exists. Go look into that more. Like, I can sort of provide the springboards, right, of new potential ways of moving forward that they can then go look into. But I don't do all that work myself because I would not have the bandwidth to do that.
It's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. Exactly. And so then as new people come onto the project, right, these were like they usually start with something that was like, oh yeah, this was a thing that we didn't have time to get to, or it was an idea on the project that just hasn't come to fruition yet. Do you just like want to start working on that? It may or may not work, whatever. But then I found that like, if you give students agency, they will also just drive the projects in the directions that they want. And then they start doing their own thing, right? Like, I have a new second-year graduate student who's very interested in materials and electrochemistry and stuff. And he has been pitching stuff that I'm like, I would never think about a redox flow battery. What? You know? But he's really interested in that. So I'm like, great. If you can make it work, let's do it. And so I manage it by giving a lot of power to my students to be able to do it. But that also means that they have to step up and do that, right? And so, yeah, it can be challenging, but overall, like, my students are very good and they will get there, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And as, you know, I'm in my 3rd year, so, you know, I'm still trying to figure those things out. And, you know, we're primarily a master's institution, so that timeline is a little bit shorter.
Harder,
so
yeah.
it's like, you know, but no, I think I try to give my students as much agency as possible. But yeah, like, if you're in grad school, you know, hopefully you have that agency. And, you know, what I love about students is that they don't have the same, like, indoctrinated thoughts that I have. Yes. They can think about things differently because they don't have the same things that I've learned over the past year, so they can, you know, be a little bit more elastic in their thinking. Mm-hmm. And I encourage them to be that way. Yeah. And you know, it often works out for the better, for sure.
Yeah. That institutional knowledge piece is so important. What the timeline is for turnover matters. Yeah. So like, that's why I'm like quite intentional to like try and have that 5-year like turnover to like keep things consistent. Because I saw that kind of from both sides. My PhD group was very graduate student driven. We had a couple postdocs, but it was mostly grad students. And then my postdoc group, when I joined, was twice as many postdocs as graduate students. And I saw the rapid turnover that was like suddenly like, oh, nobody is doing this group job because it was this person and they just left and nobody has come in to replace it. What are we going to do? You know? And so like, I think a lot about institutional knowledge and how do you make sure that it's getting passed down and stuff like that. Because yeah, like, and we've had to have that conversation in my group too, as we've gotten bigger. The difference between 6 graduate students and 9 graduate students was massive.
Yeah.
It was like, wow, okay, we went from like, it felt like a small group to what feels like a big group, and that happened last year. And so it was like, oh, I suddenly do not have the bandwidth to do all of the things that I've been doing, right? Like, I cannot be as involved in all of the things like I was my first couple of years. And so we've had to have those conversations where I'm like, hey, look, guys, like, I can't do that anymore, right? I still want to support you, and I can still do these things, but I can't do these other things. And so I need you all to be helping each other with this process. And so every year is different. Every year has been a learning process. This is why we do feedback every year, where like we have like these group development group meetings where it's just kind of like me soliciting feedback on things that I want to get feedback on. Oftentimes our documentation, right? Like what's missing from our documentation, right? And I've had students be like, you know, oh, we do very intense feedback on like external presentations, like practice talks for external presentations. And the first time you go, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. So when they're supposed to give feedback, they don't know what they're supposed to give feedback on. So like, can we document that? And I'm like, absolutely. So I made a document for that. But then there were other things where it was like, oh, the first year graduate students, when we're onboarding them, are asking me questions that really the older grad students should be answering. Things like, you know, literature searching. They do that a lot more than I do now. I still do it, but not as much as they do. Or like using the electronic lab notebooks or using Zotero or whatever. I'm like, really, the students should be talking about that. And so now we're like building a new way of onboarding first year grad students that the older students can help with instead of me doing all of it, right? Yeah. So every year it's just been an evolution of me being like, okay, what do I need to do and what do I not need to do? And how do we like differentiate that in a very intentional way such that we're still serving like the students as best we can, but actually thinking about like who is the best person to be communicating this.
Yeah. I need to figure out my onboarding process and figure out that rotation, but on a 2-year scale.
That's so much harder
instead of a 5-year scale. So yeah, it's like they start doing research and then we're running, and we don't start running until, you know, they're ready to graduate. And so yeah, but no, you've given me a lot of great ideas and a lot of information that I will probably take advantage of. So this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for coming on. Is there anything you would like to shout out? Any projects you're doing? Any people you want to shout out? Just go ahead. You can take the time to.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me on. It's very fun to do things like this. I think if there are any undergraduates listening, I know that that's a big audience that you have, like really consider grad school. I think that it's a really awesome place to grow and learn a lot. It's very different from undergrad. And yeah, check out the University of Minnesota. I think we have a really great department. There's lots of really cool science going on. And yeah, I'll make sure to give you a lot of links to a lot of resources.
Yeah, please give me all the links to everything, and please look into Jessica Moore if you are interested in her research. Look up those papers that'll be in the description. And once again, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. I'll see you guys on the next one.